Welcome to The Blitz, a podcast from Coram Deo Church. The Blitz is all about tackling tough topics head-on at full speed. Are you ready? Well, what's up, guys? My name is Pastor John. I will be your host today on this episode of The Blitz. You may have noticed I decided to change up my intro there. Decided just to, what the heck? Let's have some fun together, right? So, welcome to The Blitz. I'm your host. We're going to have some fun today. Because it's Pride Month, we're dealing specifically with questions and issues and challenges that are pertaining to the LGBTQ ideology, agenda, revolution that is kind of taken over here. So we're dealing with lots of questions that people have, and the question I'm dealing with this morning is this: is the LGBTQ, whatever letters you want to throw in there after there, plus, is that a sign that God's judgment is coming? Okay, so is the pervasive sexual immorality that is spreading through our culture, and the not just tolerance of it, but the approval of it, and the celebration of it, and the taking pride in it, should that be a harbinger of sorts? Should that be a sign that God's judgment is coming? And so I'm going to answer that by saying no, but that doesn't mean what you think it means. Okay, so let's look at Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 25 together. I'll just read it for you here briefly, reading from the ESV. It says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world and the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore, God gave them up in the lust of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever." Verse 26, "For this reason God gave them up to dishonorable passions, for their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error." Those last couple verses, those last couple verses are dealing specifically with homosexual behavior and would include everything that is part of the LGBTQ plus agenda. Now, what's important to know about this passage? Well, there's a couple things. Let's just go through them together. First of all, the Apostle Paul says that everybody knows about God. Knowledge of God is not limited to just a small group of people or people who believe in God, but rather God has made himself known, and he's made knowledge about himself plain, and has shown it to them, and he has shown it to them in creation, meaning that God's eternal power and his divine nature are clearly perceived in creation. When we submit ourselves and apply ourselves to the study of nature, what we are looking at is a physical sermon that is preaching back to us about the divine nature and the eternal attributes of God. And so that's plain to everybody. Everybody has access to this information. You don't need special goggles to get this. It's everywhere, and it is so abundant. The Apostle Paul says that people are without excuse. So the issue is not lack of information about God. Rather, Paul says that information is suppressed. So what may be known about God is abundant and clear, but that's not desired. It's not liked. And so that knowledge is suppressed, and the truth of God is exchanged for a lie, and the glory of God is exchanged for another glory. Okay, so that's the fundamental problem with all of humanity. We have knowledge about God. We don't like the knowledge of God. We suppress the truth of God. That God void has to be filled. And so we take the truth of God, we exchange it for a lie about God. We take the glory of God and we exchange it for a lesser glory. Okay, now that's what all people do. All people do that. But what Paul says here is really interesting. He doesn't say that, and therefore, right, God is going to judge them because the sexual sins are coming. What Paul clearly says is that because we have exchanged the truth of God for a lie, because we suppress the truth of God, God gives us up. That is to say that God gives us over to the most vile and corrupt desires of our hearts. Remember, the first verse said the wrath of God is revealed. It doesn't say the wrath of God will be revealed, but rather the wrath of God, the judgment of God is being revealed. And a core element, an essential part of God's judgment is that God gives people over to the corrupt desires of their heart. It seems to be as if there is some restraining measure that God removes when people continually suppress the truth and exchange the truth of God for a lie. At some point, God says, I am pulling back the restraints on your wickedness, and I am going to give you over to the darkest, most corrupt desires of your heart. In a sense, God is giving people what they want, what they desire. They are given over to those corrupt desires. Okay? So God's judgment does not necessarily, it's not spoken of in this word as coming as a result of actions that follow those desires, but God's judgment results in the unhindered pursuit of those desires in and of themselves. And then as Paul identifies these actions that God has given people over to, he specifically calls out all lesbian behavior and all homosexual behavior. He talks about women lying with women. That's his way of speaking of women who are involved sexually with other women. And then he calls out men who are sexually active with other men, who are consumed with passions for one another. And then he refers to these acts as shameless, and as a result, they receive in themselves the due penalty. Okay? So here is the picture that Paul is saying. Paul doesn't say, hey, you guys, all of this sexual immorality, all of this homosexuality, you better watch out because God's judgment is going to come against this. What Paul's saying is that homosexuality is God's judgment, right? Wherever that takes off, wherever that is rampant, wherever the LGBTQ agenda sets in, where it's accepted, it's embraced, it is celebrated, i.e. Pride Month, that is not a sign that God's judgment is coming. That is a sign that God's judgment is here and it's present, because one of the things God does in his judgment is he gives people over. He hands them over to what they want. Think about a parent and a child, right? There are many things that a child wants, and some of those things that a child wants would be utterly disastrous for that child to receive. So, for example, a kid may want to stay up forever and think, hey, that's the best thing, but the parent knows, oh my gosh, you're going to be a mess. Or the child just wants to eat processed sugar all of the time, And of course, the parent knows, you know what, if you do that, you're going to have no teeth and you're going to be really ugly and it's going to be painful. There's all these things that an immature human being is going to desire, but a parent is not going to give them over to those things because they know those things will be destructive, right? And to give that child over to those desires would be to allow that individual to receive the judgment that those desires have, okay? Well, here's the thing. God is our Father, right? He is a good God. He is holy. He is righteous, right? And we as his children, we have persistently suppressed the truth. We continually want nothing to do with God. And so we exchange the truth of God for a lie. And that lie is a pervasive lie. It's not just a lie about the existence or non-existence of God. It's a lie about what God desires. It's a lie about what we are as human beings. It's a lie about what is consistent with our joy, what is good for our souls, what is good for our bodies. It is a lie that goes through absolutely everything. And so we exchange the truth of God and we cling on to this lie. And yet we have a hunger for glory because we have exchanged the glory of the immortal, eternal God. And we still have a glory hunger. And so we're pursuing this glory, right? But we have rejected God. And there comes a point in which God says, okay, I'm giving you over to the corrupt desires of your heart. No longer am I going to restrain you from what you want to do, from those behaviors that are detrimental and harmful to yourself, because you have persistently refused me. You have persistently ignored me. You have rejected me. And so in judgment, I am going to give you what you want. I'm going to give you over to the corrupt desires of your heart. And with that activity, there will come due penalty for that error. Okay? And what that means is that we need to look at not just this particular moment, but we need to be examining sexual immorality and understand Pride Month and LGBTQ plus ideology, revolution, whatever you want to throw in there. We need to understand it in light of God's word. And what God's word says is not that because of these things, a judgment is going to come in the future. But what it tells us is that these things are indicators and signs that God's judgment is here. It's present. And we're seeing it carried out in the lives of people who embrace this ideology. That behavior is itself the judgment. And it's a judgment that brings, the Apostle Paul says, a due penalty, meaning this is a kind of behavior that is only going to lead to destruction. As long as somebody is on that road and on that path, there is going to be a due penalty that they will receive in themselves because of it. There are consequences. There are weighty, significant, and costly consequences to the individuals that submit themselves to this lie and to this pattern of life. So the LGBTQ agenda and the revolution that we are witnessing is not a sign that God's judgment is coming. Rather, we need to understand it is a sign that God's judgment is here. It is here, and it is being carried out right before our own eyes. And I'll say this again, as Christians, we cannot support the type of ideology and behavior that God says is his judgment. Right? This is not good for people. This is not consistent with people's ultimate joy and flourishing. This is utterly consistent with what God has created people and called people for. That's why statements like the one that was tweeted by James Smith about you are loved and affirmed. LGBTQ, you are loved and affirmed. You guys, we need to love our neighbors, but we cannot affirm the behavior, any behavior that is self-destructive. We cannot affirm that behavior which God says is the result of his judgment and giving an individual over the corrupt desires of their heart. We can't participate in that. We can't celebrate that. We can't endorse that. We can't affirm that, because those things are not a sign or a warning that judgment is coming. Paul says they are exactly what judgment looks like itself. All right, friends, that's all we've got for this episode of The Blitz. Until next time, take care.